When the time came, Casey listened for the sound of gunfire, there was nothing, and he began to conjure visions of ambush, but then the sound of the Mapei rockets broke the silence, and just then the scouts reported to Krulak that the enemy was dead ahead, when the small Japanese garrison of Sangi learned of the impending attack by a much larger force. They withdrew from the village toward prepared positions in the mountains. Thus the coastal column had no difficulty in entering Sangai, which was deserted. But at almost that moment, Quack force moved up to the perimeter of the Japanese mountain position, which the Japanese garrison had just reached. KACS men began to move forward. Firing, they found the Japanese in bunkers and rifle pits among the huge banyan trees with their multiple trunks that gave such good shelter. Snipers had climbed into the trees and were firing down on the Marines. KAC sent one platoon around to the enemy's left to flank it, was accompanied by the regimental machine gun platoon, which put 2 heavy guns forward. The Japanese in the forward line were thus threatened and fell back, but they did not leave easily or quickly, and in the fighting Colonel Krulak and Captain Spencer Pratt of F Company were both wounded. The Japanese fell back, but almost immediately executed a banzai charge in which the Japanese riflemen crawled and wriggled up to the line, and then rushed forward, shouting, screaming, hurling grenades and bayoneting. They penetrated the Marine line, the cost was heavy, and this first wave fell back, but it was followed almost immediately by another charge, and again the Marines' M1 rifles and the machine guns took a heavy toll after the Japanese had again retreated. The Americans counted 74 Japanese bodies on the field, but Crack also had his casualties 6 men dead and 12 men wounded, 2 of them seriously. The Marines stopped to bury their dead and then went back to the Vagara River to wait. Company E had an easy time of it. The men entered Sangi without opposition and blew up all the Japanese installations with demolition charges. They also destroyed a new Daihatsu and captured a number of Japanese papers, including charts of the Banville-Schwaz area that showed a Japanese minefield of the Shortlands area, and the Datu Rots Company E then turned about and returned to the Vagara River. The next day, the Navy landing boat crews had repaired the damaged boat, and the craft were able to return CAC's force to the base at Veza on the afternoon of November 1st. A Dumbo plane arrived at Vosa and evacuated the wounded to Guadalcanal. The charts of the Japanese minefield were also sent back to Admiral Holly, and he ordered up a M-laying mission for the Shan's area during the battle for Banville. At least 2 Japanese ships were sunk in the middle of channels that appeared on their charts to be perfectly safe after destroying the Sangai garrison. Lieutenant Colonel Krulak had to be ready for a swift Japanese countermove from the south, where the majority of troops were located. He waited meanwhile an airdrop replenished the supply of 250 hand grenades and explosives, as well as rice for the native carriers and scouts. The orders had been to make a big noise to frighten the Japanese. And so on October 31st, Major Warner Bigger, the battalion executive officer, set out to the north with a large patrol. He learned that the Japanese had already reoccupied Sangi and were rebuilding the installation there. What the Marines did not know was that the immediate area was actually teeming with Japanese who had been brought over from Kolombangara. Bigger encountered several small units, but had no way of understanding the significance of these patrols. Bigger returned with his report to the base that night, and the next day he set out with 90 men to move up the coast, destroying Japanese outposts, and then shell the small craft base in Schwaz Bay. There was another smaller base on Guppy Island, south of the bay, that was given as an alternative target major. Bigger had his difficulties. The maps showed that the Warrior River, which he wanted to use for movement, was navigable by small schooners, but the landing craft continually grounded and the boats had to be abandoned. Rigger's scouts did not really know the terrain and got the unit hopelessly mired down in a swamp. Bigger sent Lieutenant Raya Duncan back with the radio to get in touch with Krulak, and the Japanese moved in between Bigger and Duncan, and surrounded Duncan the lieutenant, and his squad managed to break through the line, get to the boats, and make their way to Visa, where he reported that Bigger was cut off Lieutenant Colonel Krulak, then asked Guadalcanal for an airstrike and a PT boat mission against the Japanese in the area to cover Rigger's retreat. But Major Bigger did not know that the Japanese were behind him. and on the morning of November 2nd he moved on toward Schwaz Bay with the help of a local warrior who did know the terrain. He sent a small patrol back to the Warrior River to tell the boat crews to meet them up the coast. The patrol ran into the Japanese and had to fight its way through, losing one man. Corporal Winston Gallagher, Bigger, pushed on through the swamp and jungle to Schwaz Bay. He ran into a 4-man Japanese patrol. The Marine opened fire and killed 3 of the Japanese, but the 4th man escaped into the jungle, and Bigger had to assume that the American presence would be reported. It seemed too risky to move further towards Schwaz Bay, so he elected to hit the alternative target at Guppy Island, which was a supply dump for the Schwaz Bay area. The trouble was that the shore facing Guppy Island was overgrown with trees and bushes that hung to the water's edge, so the mortars had to be set in the water with only their muzzles prottering. It was not the easiest mortar position in the world, but the mortarmen managed to put 120 rounds of high explosive shells into the area, and they hit something for a large fire erupted. Satisfied that he had made enough of a racket to impress the Japanese Major Bigger, then headed back toward his base. He still knew nothing of the Japanese behind him, and when he reached the mouth of the Warrior River, Major Bigger first set up the defense perimeter and then settled down after a rest. He would send a patrol across the river to make contact with Lieutenant Duncan's patrol, which was supposed to be there. Several of the Marines asked for permission to go for a swim, and Bigger gave it. The Marines dove in and began swimming, and upstream a Japanese patrol was moving along the bank of the river. When one member saw the swimmers, the Japanese immediately opened fire on them, and that is how Major Bigger became aware that he was in the presence of his enemies. The Japanese moved swiftly down the bank of the river and attacked the Marine position, not knowing how strong it was. The paratroopers were not caught napping, and in the firefight their heavier weapons and more rapid rate of fire of the M1 rifles made the difference. No Americans were hit, but several Japanese were killed or wounded, and the Japanese patrol retired. Obviously, it was not a good idea to bring boats to this side of the river with the Japanese upstream. Major Bigger sent Lieutenant Samuel Johnston, Platoon Sergeant Frank Muller, and Private Paul Pareto swim across the river to find Duncan and see that the boats did not move across the river. They swam across. What happened next is still a matter for conjecture. One story has it that just as they were about to stand up and walk to the beach, another Japanese patrol fired on them. Private Parr escaped because he was a slow swimmer and had lagged way behind the other 2. In any event, it is definite that he turned around and swam back to the western shore of the river and reported to Major Bigger what was happening. One story has it that Lieutenant Johnston was wounded by the Japanese volley and sank into the water, and Sergeant Muller was killed as P.E. swam away. He said he saw a Japanese come to the water's edge and haul Johnston's limp body ashore. Another story has it that Johnston went on ahead and managed to make contact with a Skellen member of the Coast Watcher team, who led him towards the headquarters. They ran into a patrol, said the Coast Watcher and Lieutenant Johnston surrendered whatever had happened. Johnston and Muller were lost when Private Pear told his story. At first, Major Bigger believed that his patrol had been fired on by Duncan and his men, who had not correctly identified them. Consequently, he brought out a large American flag and waved it at the river. The result was a burst of gunfire that answered the question. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Duncan remained unbroken, and the movement out was uneventful. The Schwaz feint was ended. How much good had it done? It had not. As whole staff had hoped, caused the Japanese to move any large segment of troops into Schwaz. It had cost the Japanese some men, but it had also cost the Americans 9 men killed, 14 wounded, and 2 missing. What had happened to the missing men was questionable. As we have seen, there are indications that at least one was captured, and that he had enough of the overall Banville plan in his possession to show that the Americans had made a feint here, and that the major action was to be at Empress Augusta Bay. But as so often happened with the Japanese, the officers at headquarters did not believe the soldiers in the field, and they ignored the warning about place and time, so the captures did not have the significance they might have had as far as the American effort was concerned. It had really accomplished very little except the destruction of a few landing barges and several hundred tons of Japanese supplies to counter. That was an unexpected negative. The Japanese jerried that they had driven off a major American landing, and the Schwaz natives tended to believe them. This belief made the Coast Watchers' job much harder and tended to turn more natives pro-Japanese, as were the Bougainvilleans. The Coast Watchers, needless to say, were not pleased with the outcome, but overall the two feints at the treasuries and Skizzle had kept the Japanese guessing and unprepared at the moment that it was important those last few hours before the troops were to be put ashore at Empress Augusta Bay. Whatever else they had done, they had bought time and kept Admiral Kusaka and General Imamura a little bit off base. In one sense, the Americans could never have chosen a better spot for a landing on Banville than Cape Torokina, as the Central Solomons campaign had progressed, and the 17th Japanese Army had begun to realize that there was a good possibility that they would be defending Banville soon. They had looked over the beach areas with an eye to Allied possibilities. They had rejected Cape Torokina as most unlikely because of the low swampy ground. Consequently, Lieutenant General Masatani Kanda, the commander of the Japanese 6th Division, had sent only a single company of the 2nd Battalion of the 23rd Infantry to maintain an outpost there, but the Americans saw Cape Torokina. In a different light, it was the best possible landing spot on the west coast of Banville by landing. There the Americans would cut off the shortlands to the south and bypass a large number of troops to be sure these troops could be brought up to fight. But that would take some time further. By putting an airstrip in quickly, they would be close enough to Rabaul to attack that base, and High did not forget that the whole reason for this march northward along the Solomon chain was to knock out. Rabaul, to make this landing high, had chosen the 3rd Marine Division. He felt more comfortable with Marines than with Army soldiers, which was certainly understandable, and particularly so given the performance of the Army on New Georgia. Major General R. Turnage would command the reinforced Marine Division, which meant 14,000 troops. There was plenty of transport for this invasion troopships and cargo vessels, a dozen of them guarded by 11 destroyers. 8 M-sweepers and a number of other support ships began heading for Banville. At the end of October, they took several different routes so that the Japanese search planes would be thrown off if one unit of 4 ships was seen. That's how it was reported. The idea was to conceal from the enemy the size and power of the Banville landing force. Before dawn on November 1st, the convoys had converged and were moving in along the west side of Banville. The ships would stand off about 3 miles from the beach and unload their troops into landing craft. The day dawned bright and clear. The sun came up at 6:14, and the wind was so slight that the troops lining the rails of the transports could see wisps of smoke curling upward from Mount Bagana, the live volcano that towered over this section of Banville. The scene was lush and green, the epitome of the tropical paradise, and as day dawned, the Minin sweepers moved in ahead of the transports to look for trouble. They found no mines and reported that there was enough water for the transports to follow their plan. The transports moved in, the Americans looked toward Cape Torokina, and saw no evidence of the enemy's small wonder for the total enemy force. There was the reinforced company of 270 men with a single 75 mm gun and a wireless connection to the world. General Kanda had been sure that the Allies would land east of Cape Torokina. There were about 2,500 troops in the area, but they were not readily available for defense. No one was deceived that this landing would be a cakewalk. However, Rabaul was only a little over 200 miles away, which meant that within an hour after landing things could start to happen, although the Army's 5th Air Force had twice claimed to have knocked out virtually the entire Rabaul Air Force. It was not true, and Holly knew it was not true. In defense of the Army claims, it must be said that the Japanese had become masterful at the arts of camouflage and concealment. All base personnel, even pilots, had to participate in the building of fake aircraft that were cleverly designed to look like Zero's dive bombers. Torpedo planes and twin-engined bombers. These were built by the score out of bamboo and paper. 5th Air Force planes came over and bombed and strafed, and the mock-up planes burned beautifully. Every pile of bamboo and paper ash became a statistic in the Allied reports. The exaggerated reports of destruction were a real tribute to the Japanese camouflage experts. Admiral Wilkinson had been Director of Naval Intelligence in 1942, and shortly after a stint as a battleship division commander, he had gone to work for Holly as Deputy Commander South Pacific, so Wilkinson knew all about what had happened in the Guadalcanal campaign before he ever took over from Kelly Turner as commander of the amphibious landings. He had no illusions about Japanese air power, remembering what had happened at Guadalcanal. He built his whole plan for Banville around quick turnaround. Get in, get the men and supplies off, and get the transports and cargo ships out of those waters before the Japanese air and sea forces began showing up H-hour. Admiral Wilkinson announced would be 7:30 a.m. at 5:45 a.m. 4 destroyers began sporadic fire on the beach at 6:45 a.m. The transports were anchored in a line with the cargo ships in another line 500 yards further out. The troops began moving down into the landing craft, and at 7:10 a.m. the boats from the President Adams began their run in toward the beach. The destroyers increased their rate of fire and began firing patterns aimed to destroy enemy concentrations. 31 torpedo bomber fighters from Munda showed up to bomb and strafe along the beach line. All this softening up had ended by 7:26 a.m., when the first wave of Marines from the 2nd Battalion landed 5 minutes later. Troops were coming in to the rest of the 12 beach areas. Assigned in that first wave, 8,000 troops went ashore, 8,000 against 270. But those 270 Japanese were dug in. They had 18 pillboxes and connecting tunnels and trenchworks to protect them. One Japanese platoon with several heavy machine guns was stationed on Purua Island, and a squad was located on Torokina Island. The 75 mm gun was set on the northwest shoulder of Cape Torokina, above the landing area. The Americans soon became aware of all these facts, and as the landing craft came in line with Purua Island, they came under fire from machine gun crossfire from the Cape, the tip of Purata Island, and Torina Island. It was murderous fire, but the boats sped on. They had chosen the only sensible course. The number of casualties was fairly light, and once the landing craft got inside that deadly crossfire, they were again in trouble from fire that originated on Cape Torina itself. The 75 mm gun was so placed as to range along the beaches during the morning. The gunners fired 50 high explosive shells and did a good deal of damage. Boat number 21 from the President. Adams got the full treatment as the boat neared the beach. It took 3 shells from the 75 mm gun in rapid succession. The first shell killed the boat's coxswain, and the boat went out of control, and the second and third shells killed the 2 officers aboard the landing craft. As well as 12 enlisted men, 14 others were wounded. The survivors got over the side and swam to the beach, where they began fighting with rifles and hand grenades. Meanwhile, the dead boat had drifted ashore, still filled with the wounded, and the dead, Corporal John McNamara, saw that the wounded had to be gotten back to the ship, and he tried to get the landing boat under control. He tried to push the boat off the beach. It would not move. He found another man to help him, and he and the other man finally got the boat into the water again, got the engine going and backed the boat into the sea. Having been holed in a number of places, the boat promptly sank. Most of the wounded went down with the boat, and the dead, only 4 or 5 men, survived. That 75 mm gun shot up the boat group commander's craft, and did so much damage to others that the landing became disorganized. The men began landing catch as catch can, and the minute they hit the beach, they ran into rifle and machine gun fire from the defenders. The result was that whole units lost contact with their officers surprisingly. However, the individual Marines were able to keep moving. Each Marine had been told what the mission was, and in spite of the confusion, each kept moving ashore and fighting the enemy. Sergeant Robert A. Owens of the 3rd Marines. A company got ashore and realized that the 75 mm gun was creating havoc on the beach. He set out with his squad to destroy the gun. He located the gun, which was inside a palm log and sand bunker, and he posted 4 men to cover the bunkers next to the gun position. Then he started up the hill to hit the gun himself. As he went, he saw that his men were being shot down one by snipers, but there was no stopping, even though he was soon wounded several times himself. In this instance, the small caliber of the enemy rifles worked in one American's favor. He could keep on going. Though badly hurt, he moved up to the gun, crawled through the fireport, firing his weapon, and killed several members of the gun crew. The others fled out the back, where they were shot down by other Marines. Owens emerged through the back of the emplacement and then fell dead from his wounds when the Marines examined the 75 gun. They saw that the crew had just placed a new round in the breech as Owens came up, and he had caught them in the act of firing again. They had plenty of ammunition on hand. This action obviously prevented the enemy from causing many more casualties on the landing beaches, and Owens was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumous. But the 75 gun was not the only difficulty. The handful of Japanese were skillful and dedicated. The 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Marines and the 2nd Raider Battalion found themselves all mixed together on the beach. The effective enemy fire had caused the boat crews to hurry in and land at the closest point, rather than where they were supposed to. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph P. McCaffrey, commander of the 2nd Raider Battalion, rallied his men as they came confused out of the boats and got them going. He kept fighting until he was mortally wounded, and by that time the situation was beginning to come under control. The 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Marines and the 9th Marines landed on beaches that were not so heavily defended as those near the Cape, but they had something else to worry about: terrain. The beach dropped off sharply in this area, and the boats could not come in and hold their position. The jungle grew right down to the edge of the water, which did not help. Any soon boats began to broach, and before the day was out, 64 landing craft vehicle personnel and 22 landing craft mechanized were stranded. Many of them did not get unloaded. The 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Raiders was assigned to take out the Japanese on Purata Island. The task was harder than it looked. The Japanese had dug in. Well, their positions were nicely camouflaged, and they were firing from rifle pits and pillboxes, and as usual they had established interlocking fields of fire. Guadalcanal had taught its lessons. The Marines were ready for this development. It was slow-going, but inch by inch they combed the island, and as night fell they dug in and kept alert for Japanese activity. When morning came, they went back to the combing, and by noon they had eliminated the Japanese from Purua Island. They did not take prisoners on the first wave. More than half of the 8,000 Marines of the assault force got ashore, and the rest kept coming in view of the sheer numbers of Americans. That single company of Japanese defenders did an astounding job of slowing down the Marines. For most of a day, those interconnecting trenches seemed to run everywhere. They had snipers in the trees and fallback positions for their machine guns by 7:30 a.m. in the morning. The Japanese air attack that had worried Admiral Wilkinson was beginning to come in. The American Air Force had produced fighter cover over the beaches, but the Japanese sent down Zeros and bomb, using the usual technique of stalling the American fighters with the Zeros, while the dive bombers tried to work their way in. The result was a number of Japanese planes shot down, but some bore in to bomb the destroyer. Wadsworth was hit, and 2 men were killed, and 5 others were wounded. Japanese fighters came roaring over the beaches, strafing, but the Marines had been taught that the first thing to do when you stopped moving was to dig, and they dug. The strafing casualties were minimal all day long. The Japanese sent in air attacks, and for the most part they were driven off by the fighter cover. Occasionally a plane got through, but even then the results were not serious, except in one respect. Every air raid caused the stoppage of unloading twice. During this first day, the transports had to haul out and move into deep water to maneuver defensively. That meant the unloading was slowed down, but by the end of the second day, all that problem seemed to be solved, and the supply lies were ashore. The Japanese fought bravely all the way, and by the end of the first day the Marines had established 3 main defensive positions. The Japanese defense force, or what remained of it, had been driven back to a prepared position not far from the west bank of the P River, about a mile above the beach on the map. The Marine situation looked good, but in fact the Marines were in a dangerous fix. The terrain was virtually a trap, except for 2 lines of approach to Cape Torina. The land was swamp, and dense jungle attempts to establish lateral communication created enormous difficulties. The jungle was so thick that the troops were lucky to push ahead 50 yards in an hour. Whether there were Japanese in front of them or not, the Marines discovered that an old trail to a mission down by the beach. LED from the Vera River. The 2nd Raiders put up a trail block between the beach and the Japanese position up the mountain, and the unloading continued. On November 2nd, patrols went out all along the beach line to probe up the mountains. On November 3rd, Two platoon from the 3rd Raider Battalion moved to Torokina Island under cover of a bombardment by 75 pack howitzers. They found the Japanese had disappeared, and at this point organised resistance in the Torina area had come to an end. The CBEs began to come in to build roads. Parties set out to find and bury the dead Japanese. They found 192 enemy bodies. The Japanese who had retreated from the area reassembled and counted the men of the 2nd Company reinforced. Of the 270 men, only 78 had survived. And on the Japanese side that day there had been many heroic deeds. But there were no medals for Japanese servicemen. They were expected to die heroically for nation and emperor. In fact, the officers of any unit that gave up its position were subject to a certain criticism for dying on post, but those Japanese of Torokina, which they called Tarina, did not deserve the criticism. There had been just too many Marines and too much firepower for them to do any better than they had on Guadalcanal and the other islands. The American troops had been sorely troubled by the Japanese ability to infiltrate or to remain silently in position as the battle surged past them, then emerge at night and raise havoc inside the American perimeter at Banville. The Americans had a new weapon, the war dog, and these dogs were Doberman pinchers. Long known for their aggressive dispositions at Banville, they paid their way immediately by pointing out snipers and concealed Japanese positions. The effectiveness of the old Japanese techniques was reduced, and the worry of the Marines at night was lessened on the 2nd day. The beachhead was now established to a depth of a little more than a mile. Construction was to be the next step. First roads, and a fighter strip had to be built to make the island defences work. A bomber field site had to be located and then captured, and various supply dumps had to be located and protected from the air attacks that would be coming right now. The Marines had a toehold on Banville, and not much more. Admiral Holly knew that Bugville was too important to the Japanese for the landing there to go unchallenged. He suspected that the Japanese would counter first with an attempt to force a sea battle. Thus, as the amphibious landing ships set out from Guadalcanal and the newer bases in the Central Solomons, so did United States Task Force 39-4 cruisers and 8 destroyers under Admiral Merrill. The ship sailed at 2:30 in the morning of October 31st to bombard Booker and the Shortlands, and to seek battle with any Japanese ships that came down. Soon they were in the slot moving northward. A Japanese search plane spotted them there that morning and radioed the word to Rabaul, and as noted, the Japan had been surprised by the Allied landings. The landing in the treasuries had been so inconclusive that Admiral Kogre had been unwilling to react. The landing at Schwaz was quickly recognized as a feint, and then it was apparent at True and Rabaul that the real landing had to be either on Banville or on New Britain, if the Allies believed they could take on Rabaul at this particular moment. Still, Admiral Koga had to wait, but the Japanese counterplan was already in motion. It was the Roe operation, and it was a 3-pronged response to the Allied move on land, on sea, and in the air to prepare for Rogo. The Japanese had been funneling planes down to Rabaul by the score. No American carriers except escort carriers had been reported in the area recently, and Admiral Kogre, not expecting to use his carriers, had stripped them of many of their planes and pilots, and added these to the strength of the 11th Air Fleet. With the word that the American Marines had landed at the treasuries, the Roe operations began. Admiral Koga sent a large force of cruisers down to Rabaul. They would escort the counter-landing force to Banville, and then seek battle with the American cruisers expected to come up from Guadalcanal. Admiral Shentaro Amori had arrived at Rabaul within the past few hours in the heavy cruiser Miyoko, and with the heavy cruiser Haguro, they had escorted a large merchant convoy down from TRU, having some second thoughts. Koga had also sent for Admiral Ozawa and the carriers Shokaku Zuikaku and Zui Hobut. These were at sea, and it would be several days before they could reach Rabaul. Thus, for the first time in months, Admiral Samima, the commander of the 8th Fleet, had at his disposal a force powerful enough to send out to do battle with the enemy cruisers. He prepared to dispatch Amori southward to find the American cruiser force and destroy it. Amori had the 2 heavy cruisers, the light cruisers Send Up, and Agano and 7 destroyers. The one commander in the whole force who was familiar with these waters was Admiral Uin, who was assigned to assist Amori Uin, went to the flagship on the afternoon of October 31st to confer with Admiral Omori and Admiral Matsubara, who was in command of the Agano and 3 destroyers. Omori had just returned from the homeland and was not up to date on battle tactics. Matsubara was not experienced in night fighting, which Uin knew was going to be a problem at best. The Japanese would see the Americans before they were. The destroyers kept after them and drove them away. After bombarding Bua, the ships moved down to the shortlands to bombard the enemy troops and installations on Fisi Island and Poang Island. By 700 a.m. the shooting was all over, and the task force steamed back toward Vilayela. Several of the destroyers were short of fuel, so they moved down to Hatham Sound to refuel from a barge. There admittedly the Japanese high command at Rabaul had been caught napping by the American invasion of Banville, but once the word reached Rabaul, General Imamura had swung into action. He had conferred with Admiral Samima, and they had discussed the cooperation orders from Tokyo. So within a matter of hours after the Marines landed at Point Torokina, the Japanese were loading 4 transport destroyers with 880 army troops of the No. 2 Kenbai Admiral Omori's force, sailed just before 2:30 in the afternoon of November 1st, and the transport division came along a few miles behind the Amagiri Uzuki Unagi, and Fuzuki were supposed to reach the southern part of Geza 1 Empress Oyster Bay, where they woodland their reinforcements. At that point they were supposed to meet the attack squadron that would cover their activity in mid-afternoon. Admiral Merrill learned of the movements of the Japanese and set a course north to meet them. The first sign of trouble for the Japanese came shortly after dark. AB-24 broke out of the clouds and bombed the cruiser Sendai, but did not score any hits. Then came word from Japanese scout planes that a large American force was standing off Empress Augusta Bay. The planes erroneously reported 3 battleships among the vessels, and when Admiral Samima had that news, he suddenly ordered the troop transports to turn around and return to Rabaul without unloading their troops. Admiral Amori was freed of the protective responsibility. His task now was to sink enemy ships. The Japanese were steaming through squalls, and visibility was just about 3 mil. That was a disadvantage already to men who would have to use their eyes alone to make contact with the enemy at about 10:30 a.m. An American reconnaissance bomber reported to Admiral Merrill the sighting of a Japanese formation of 8 ships. Omori actually had 10. The pilot gave position, course, and speed, and then announced he was going to attack. He attacked the Haguro but did no damage. The attack over the Haguro then launched one of its float planes, which soon found the enemy about 20 miles south of the Japanese formation. Admiral Omori then turned around to confuse the enemy about his position. That tactic worked fine when one was fighting enemies head on visual observation, but for Amori this night it did nothing but waste fuel. The American task force was tracking the Japanese already by radar. Admiral Amori was confused by another report of many ships in Empress Augusta Bay. These were actually 3 American mine layers escorted by a destroyer which had just laid a minefield north of Cape Torokina. They then retired south, passing the task force and further confusing Amori. As to the number and sort of ships he was facing, Amori turned toward Empress Auster Bay to attack the transports he had been told were just unloading there. Admiral Merrill moved his cruisers across the mouth of the bay to prevent the Japanese from entering the forces, grew closer and closer. Admiral Merrill knew precisely how the Japanese were coming and where they were. The big blips in the middle of the radar screen were the heavy cruisers, with the 2 lines of destroyers each led by a light cruiser on the flanks. The battle was fast approaching, and Admiral Amori still did not know where the enemy was. Admiral Merrill, for the first time in South Pacific history, was going to make classic use of his destroyers. They were to make a torpedo attack and then retire back beyond the range of the Japanese guns. Admiral Merrill would start the fight at ranges he believed to be beyond those of the Japanese torpedo. At 2:31 in the morning, Captain Ali Burke's 4 destroyers slipped away from the American formation to head in for their attack. They were the Charles F. Osborne, Dyson Stanley, and Claxton, and as they moved, Merrill turned around to get out of the way and let the second group of destroyers, the Spence Thatcher, Converse, and Foote, have a clear field for their attack. Just about then, a Japanese float plane did Omori the service of dropping a flare over the American cruisers and aboard the Sendai. Admiral Ewan's men saw the American ships for the first time. Ewan then ordered his destroyers to begin firing torpedoes on a right turn, and they did so as they turned. Just then Admiral Merrill ordered his cruisers to open fire on the nearest enemy ships. The nearest blip of any size happened to be the Sendai, and she caught the fire of all 4 cruisers which were firing by radar. In a minute the Sendai was in desperate trouble. Her rudder jammed, which made her virtually useless as a fighting ship. She began to burn. Meanwhile, in trying to avoid the sudden blast of cruiser gunfire, the destroyers Sidari and Shiratsuyu collided, and both suffered so much damage that they pulled away from the battle. Ewan's order to turn saved the Japanese destroyers from Captain Burke's torpedo attack. The American torpedoes slid harmlessly by into the waters where the Japanese would have been had they stayed on the old course. The Japanese opened fire on the American ships with their guns, but the range was too great for the destroyers. The 2 heavy cruisers still had not found the enemy, and they were going around in a great circle. The second group of destroyers was thoroughly confused and milled about following the heavy cruisers. The American gunfire was now concentrating on the heavy cruisers, and it was coming so close as to throw at least one destroyer captain into a panic. The skipper of the Hatsuki tried to oncoming salvos by cutting between the Haguro and the Miyoko, and the Miyoko hit her, shearing off part of the bow and wrecking 2 torpedo tubes. So half an hour into the battle, the Americans had set 1 light cruiser to burning, and the Japanese had damaged 3 of their own ships. Admiral Merrill had studied all the night actions of the past, and he could see that his problem was to avoid the Japanese torpedoes, which had always caused trouble for the American warships to do so. He kept in constant motion, changing direction, so that no matter when the Japanese launched torpedoes, he would be somewhere other than the point indicated, when they arrived, moreover, with radar fire control. All the while he was doing this, his guns continued to work. However, they did not work as well at 30 knots under violent maneuver as they would at a lesser speed that offered a more stable platform. The cruiser guns were not doing much damage to the enemy, and by this time, about 35 a.m., Admiral Omori had finally located his enemies and was returning fire with his 8 in guns. The cruiser Denver was hit several times and damaged badly enough that she had to slow down to 25 knots. Admiral Omori was trying to close the distance so his destroyers could work, and a few minutes later he seemed to have done so. The range was about 8 mil, well within the capability of the long lance torpedoes. Japanese planes did all they could to help Admiral, and just at this point they were of considerable assistance. They dropped flares over the American cruisers and lit them up brightly. Admiral Amari continued to shoot with his 8 in guns, but the Japanese gunners' aim was off this night, and they scored many near misses, but few hits. Admiral Merrill began making smoke to conceal his ships, and Omori made the error so common in these night flights, confusing manufactured smoke with the smoke of heavy fires. He believed he had hit several big ships and put them out of action. Actually, among the United States vessels, only the Denver was hurt. Captain Burke's destroyers, which had charged forth so bravely to make the first torpedo attack, then lost each other in the night. It took Burke a long time to get them into formation again. The ships then approached the sinking Sendai, and they put some more shells into her as they passed by Burke's ships. Next caught the damaged Sidar and Shiratsuyu on the radar screens, and Burr announced that he was going to start firing, but through a failure in communication, he got the idea that the ships ahead were those of the other destroyer division, and he did not fire, so the 2 Japanese ships moved off safe. Commander B.L. Austin's 4 destroyers had caught the damaged Hatsuki after her collision and had set her afire. Burke's destroyers came up to help sink her, and that 2nd destroyer division never did get off a torpedo attack because Commander Austin misunderstood Admiral Merrill's signals and got completely out of position. One of his destroyers, the Foot, ran smack into a torpedo that had been fired at the cruisers in that mad manoeuvring of mid-battle. Her stern was blown off, and she skidded to a stop in the water. The cruiser Cleveland, coming by at 30 knots, just managed to miss hitting her. It certainly was the night for collisions. The destroyer Spence sideswiped the destroyer Thatcher. The Spence then took a shell at the waterline that effectively aided her from the high-speed battle. The battle ended raggedly, with neither group of cruisers ever really coming to grips with each other. The destroyers sank the damaged Hatsuki, which went down without any survivors. Admiral Uin stayed aboard the sinking Sendai to the last, but almost miraculously he was saved, along with a small number of men. He owed that rescue to Admiral Omori, and when Omori retired he sent a message to Rabaul asking for a submarine to come to the battle scene and pick up survivors. The submarine I-14 did come and did rescue the admiral, the captain of the Sendai, and 72 other men, still more Sendai survivors, managed to get aboard rafts and reach Banville. When dawn came, both Americans and Japanese were eager to be away from the scene, because both expected air attack from the enemy. The Japanese did put forth an enormous air effort, getting 100 planes into the skies over Empress or Oyster Bay. But the effect of their raid was dismal. They managed to hit only the cruiser Montpied, and the 2 small bombs wounded only 1 man and did little damage. Many of the Japanese planes were shot down by New Zealand and American fighters before they reached the cruiser. Many more were shot down by the anti-aircraft guns of the cruisers and the destroyers, and from any standpoint it was not a very satisfactory battle. Admiral Merrill had commanded with great skill. The same cannot be said for Admiral Omori, who never came to grips with his enemy. Captain Burke had launched a brave destroyer attack, but the 2nd Division of destroyers became almost as confused as the Japanese destroyer divisions. Considering all the ships involved, the damage done by guns and torpedoes was minimal. Inter-service collisions seemed almost as damaging in terms of ability to fight. Admiral Uin was unlucky to have his flagship in the van against the radar-controlled fire of the Americans. The victory this time went to the Americans for sinking 1 Japanese light cruiser and 1 destroyer. The Japanese lost about 880 men, whereas all the American ships made it back to base, and only the Foot was badly damaged. The Americans had lost only 6 men killed and 7 injured. Admiral Merrill won the praise of his superiors, and Admiral Omori was sacked and sent back to Japan to run the submarine school. Admiral Matsubara, the commander of the ineffectual 2nd Destroy Division, was also assigned to shore duty. Only Admiral Uin came out of the battle with his reputation intact, but as for settling anything about the Banville invasion, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay was a draw. The American beach head was intact, and so was the Japanese naval fighting force at Rabaul. It would all have to be fought over again. The 5th United States Army Air Force had been hitting Rabaul hard for a month, with major attention to the ring of airfield around this important base. It was no milk run. The bases were ringed by anti-aircraft guns, and the fighter fields put up fighters. Every time Japanese action and the weather were almost equal enemies too. Some days the raids had to be called off because of foul weather over the target. On October 27th, when the Banville assault began with the landing on the Treasury Islands, General Nathan Twining's 13th Air Force lent a hand, but the 5th Air Force continued to strike Rabaul on October 29th. The bombers were there again, but on November 1st, the day of the invasion of Banville, the bombers could not make the run weather again. And the next day, however they tried to make up for it, the fighters and bombers tried to fly low to avoid detection along the way. But in St. George's Channel, they encountered 2 large Japanese warships that opened fire with everything they had. So by the time the American PLS reached Rabaul, the sky over the harbour was dark, with the aircraft fire warned the Japanese had put 100 fighters into the air that day. The fighting was fierce, and both sides lost a number of planes. The Americans, as usual, overstated the case, claiming 65 Japanese fighters shot down to 9 of their own fighters and 8 bombers. The Japanese said that only 18 of their planes were shot down, and Captain Tamichi Hara, skipper of the destroyer Shigur, claimed 5 American planes for his ship, plus a number of others badly shot up. But the most important aspect of the fight was that once again it prevented the Japanese from sending off the reinforcements to Banville. The Imperial General Staff in Tokyo had no illusions about holding Banville or even Rabaul for an indefinite period, but they had a timetable which involved shoring up the defences of the Inner Empire, and these southeastern area bastions played a most important role in that schedule. The row operation was designed to win that time on Banville, the Americans awoke on November 2nd to discover all was quiet. The Japanese had not mounted a counterattack. General Turnage soon saw that the Japanese on the west side of them did not intend to begin an offensive, so he moved the 3rd Marines to that side and transferred the 9th Marines to the west. The 3rd Marines had taken something of a beating in the landings, and the 9th Marines were fresh. The move was accomplished on foot for the most part, and there simply were no trails along the beach, and few anywhere on this west side of the island. The Marines were as secure as they could be on the uncomfortable beachhead on their left. About 7 m west of Cape Torina was the Luma River, which was a fair stream on the right flank, was the Piva River, which twisted through the jungle, and behind the centre was the 840t Mount Bagana, the smoking volcano. On November 3rd, the 2nd Raider Battalion was assigned to take over the roadblock on the P Trail. For the next 3 days, action along the beach. Head was confined to patrols, in which the Marines captured some papers and killed 13 Japanese from the papers. And the progress of the action, it seemed apparent that any Japanese reaction to the landings was going to come from the south. But the Japanese at Rabaul were having more than a little difficulty in moving the troops down to Banville to start a counteraction at Tro. Admiral Koga received the news of the defeat at Empress Augusta Bay. With considerable agitation, the setback put a big hole in his row operation before it had scarcely started, and the counter-landing was already late. Koga's next step was to send those heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers to Rabaul to prepare for a new naval strike at the Americans. These were followed by a pair of oilers and 3 troop transports escorted by the light cruiser Isuzu. However, the oil Naru and Nishomaru were bombed by planes from the Solomons, and so badly damaged that they had to be towed back to Truk for repairs. This was a real shock. The loss of an oiler always troubled a naval commander even more than the loss of a capital ship. It was a reminder of the frailty of oil-bound warships. The heavy cruiser Choai towed one of them, and a destroyer took the other. Then on November 4th, as the troop ships and their escort were about 50 miles north of Cavan, they were attacked by B-24S and one of. The transports was damaged so badly that it had to be towed into Rabaul. These forces were destined for Banville, but they were obviously very much delayed when Admiral Holly learned of the concentration of Japanese cruiser power in the Rabaul area. He was more than a little disturbed. What he needed were some heavy ships in a hurry, but there were no heavy ships for the South Pacific Command just then, because everything Admiral Nimitz could get his hands on was being used to mount the offensive against Tarawa and Makin atolls in the Gilberts, an assault scheduled to occur in just a little over 3 weeks. Admiral Holly did have one card in the hole, although he could not be certain whether it would turn out to be an ace or a joker. He had been lent one carrier task force, Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's Task Force 38, built around the carriers Saratoga and Princeton. These had been lent him for the first days of the Banville campaign, and were supposed to be going back to Nimitz, but High still had them. The problem was that American carrier doctrine still held that attacks by carrier forces on stoutly defended airbase complexes were to be avoided at all costs. The Japanese were thought to have 150 planes at Rabaul just then that would classify as stoutly defended. Actually, they had nearly twice that number, but High, who had been the first to try something new. The Marcus raid, the Doit Tokyo raid, was not a great respecter of formal doctrine. Furthermore, unlike a number of senior commanders, Holly believed that ships were built to be risked in war, and he had no hesitation in risking them. So when High learned that the cruisers Takao Maya Atago Suzuya Mami and Chikuma were all at Rabaul along with the Miyoko and the Haguro and several light cruisers, he gave orders to Admiral Sherman to make her at Rabaul on the morning of November 5th. Sherman was to go after the cruisers first of all, and then the destroyers. He would be supported by planes from the Southwest Pacific Command, which was supposed to hit Rabaul around noon. But that didn't mean much. By the time MacArthur's planes got to the big Japanese base, the carrier planes would have won or lost everything, and if one looked at the figures coldly, the chances of their winning seemed slight by speeding to the launching point and putting everything that could fly into the sky. Admiral Sherman was able to throw up 97 planes from the 2 carriers, 52 of them. Fighters, that meant 22 dive bombers and 23 torpedo bombers, would go against all those ships and the fighters the Japanese could put up in a hurry. At 9 o'clock on the morning of November 5th, Admiral Sherman had reached the launch point about 230 miles southeast of Rabaul. That was a comfortable enough margin of safety in terms of gas, but that aspect was the only comfortable part of the mission. The American pilots did not really know where the Japanese ships could be found in the big complex that was Rabaul Harbour. But they were lucky because the sky over Rabaul was clear and blue that day, and when they were 50 miles out they could see the enemy ships, 8 heavy cruisers and 20 light cruisers and destroyers. It was the sort of target the 5th Air Force would have given Summit teeth to have. The carrier pilots were even more fought than they knew, and a number of those ships had just arrived in port at 6 o'clock that morning from TR. If there was anything they were not expecting, it was an air attack from carrier planes. Commander Henry Coldwell, the leader of the American air attack, recognized from the beginning that he had a special problem with Rabaul. The Japanese had many ships, and that meant all the shore anti-aircraft guns, plus the guns of the fleet would be turned on the carrier planes. In addition, that they had to look for a very large number of Japanese fighters right above their own major base. Therefore, Commander Coldwell brought his pilots in a large travelling formation, fighters on top, and this time they held the formation as they came in toward the volcanoes, passed over them, and moved into the harbour area to bomb. Only at the last minute did the planes break off into small groups to dive bomb or go low and drop their torpedoes.